Welcome to HollyLegacy. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest videos. List of the top 10 artists who don't like the Beatles. Which legend said the Fab Four were trash, and which guitar hero said they were flipping awful? The Beatles are the most loved band in music history. Even if you don't listen to them often, most people can respect how great they were. However, many people didn't like all the fuss that came with them, especially the screaming fans. Here are the 10 artists who think less of the Beatles, especially when they were huge stars. Lou Reed talked to Joe Smith in 1987. Reed told everyone how much he hated the Beatles. "I never liked the Beatles." L. Reed once said, "I thought they were garbage. If you ask me who I liked nobody." Reed wasn't limited by what most people wanted because the Velvet Underground was different from every other rock band of the time. Ray Davies. While it's easy to think of the Beatles as musical gods, their peers didn't always hold them in such high regard. The 1960s bands like The Who, the Rolling Stones, and the Kinks were influenced by many of the same things and came up with their own sounds, but every new Beatles album was met with joy. The Kinks' Ray Davies was willing to defy expectations when asked to write a track-by-track review of Revolver for Disc and Music Echo. Ray wasn't nice about it. People thought Taxman and Your Bird Can Sing were too obvious, and Eleanor Rigby sounds like they're trying to please elementary school music teachers. Davies explicitly states that he considers Yellow Submarine to be of poor quality, which constitutes a particularly unfavorable review. Frank Sinatra hated rock and roll and modern pop music in general. Sinatra, with his smooth crooning and classic big band sound, represented the traditional era of music. Conversely, the innovative sound and cultural impact of the Beatles initiated a new wave. He hated the drug culture, the long hair, the crazy clothes, and everything else that the Beatles stood for as a generation gap. The king of pop, as kids, the Beatles looked up to Elvis. When they met Elvis in 1965, he was friendly, even though he hadn't wanted to meet them at first. However, the atmosphere changed when Elvis and Richard Nixon met in 1970. Elvis told the president that the Beatles were deeply and dangerously anti-American. At this point, the band had already announced their breakup, but Elvis said that the Beatles had been a real force for anti-American spirit. He told the president they came to America, made money, and returned to England to promote anti-Americanism. In 1971, Elvis met with Edgar Hoover at the FBI offices and told him that the Beatles' dirty looks and suggestive music were the cause of many of the problems we are having with young people today. John Coltrane has been influential since the 1950s. As a trumpet player, producer, and arranger, Quincy Jones has worked in the recording industry for a long time. Jones was already a well-known figure in the industry when the Beatles became popular in the U.S. in the mid-1960s. Jones was also not one of the millions of new fans who fell in love with the band. Paul was the worst bass player I've ever heard, and Ringo Starr doesn't even bring it up. Jones saw a vulture in 2018. Quincy Jones made headlines all over the world when he chose, for no reason, to severely criticize the Beatles. Jones said in New York Magazine that he thought the famous Liverpool band was the worst in the world when he first met them. He said that Pete Townsend and the band, like the Beatles, came from the British rock scene of the mid-1960s, but they were more like the frustrated youth of the time, loud, heavy, and violent, while appearing on Youth, a BBC talk show set in 1966 shows a whole scene. Townshend was unhappy with the sound quality of modern pop music. In particular, he didn't like how the Beatles used recording gear, which he said was Sar Cookie Baker. The Beatles' inclusion on this list is not surprising, given that Ginger Baker harbored a deep hatred for everyone. In an interview with Forbes from 2015, Baker discussed how much he disliked heavy metal bands and one Beatle who couldn't read or write music notation. Even Paul McCartney needs someone to write it down for him, and Baker thinks that's fine. Baker said that there was a piece of writing where he said that if he learned to read music, Michael Stee, who isn't known for being angry or outspoken, has never understood the Beatles, the band that made him love music as a child. When asked about his connection to I Want to Hold Your Hand, Stee admitted, I'm not really a Beatles fan, though I acknowledge their genius, but I'm just not the generation that grew up with them. It's not something I'm personally drawn to, and that's gotten me into a lot of trouble in the past. Todd Reiniger. Todd Rundgren is a very skilled singer-songwriter and musician who can play many instruments and do a wide range of styles. In an interview with Melody Maker magazine, Rundgren was very critical of Lennon. There's nothing revolutionary about John Lennon. He's just a stupid man who acts strangely and talks about revolutions to make people feel uncomfortable. All he seeks is attention for himself, and if discussing revolution garners him that attention, he is willing to resort to inappropriate actions, such as striking a waitress on the thigh. What kind of revolution does that represent? What kind of revolution is that? He's an important figure, but so was Richard Nixon. Nixon was a lot like John L. Carter from a different age. He stood for many different ideas but wasn't himself. Trent Reznor. Maybe the constant shite of 1960s and 1970s rock gods was what made Nine Inch Nails what they were. In an interview with Plasma magazine in 1994, Trent finally let out all of his anger about John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Unfortunately, Reznor later changed his mind when asked by Rolling Stone who he thinks is a genius. He said, I hate to think in a retro mindset. You know, the Beatles were the best thing. I hated people who were always talking about the Beatles. They're dead. They're ugly now. Get them out of my sight. Trent responded, it's quite obvious, but as a child, I disliked those who were fans of the Beatles, so I didn't pay much attention to them. Around the time of the downward spiral, I really started to like the White Album Beatles. From there, it spread outward. They were so far ahead of the game, it's